Hello and welcome to this special episode of Reality Check. In a world plunged into turmoil by two unexpected events, the pandemic and now war, what changes will it lead to in the global economic order and what will it mean for India? Who better to ask than Dr. Raghuram Rajan, former RBI governor, is currently professor of the University of Chicago, Booth School of Business. Great to have you, Professor Rajan, here in New Delhi and in fact in our studios. Now some are calling the double impact of the pandemic and the war the end of globalization, that this is the limits of over-dependence. We are heavily dependent on countries like Russia for energy and for China for manufactured goods. And now, because of what's happened, because of COVID, because of the war, you're attempting to decouple and you're running into the limits of that. The end of globalization sounds like a great headline, very catchy. But is there any substance to this, or is this hyperbole?
Well, there certainly are impediments which have expanded to globalization. Remember, even before the pandemic hit, China and the United States were at loggerheads over trade, over investment. We had Huawei's, executive being in jail in Canada,
right,
and a lot of angst about that. So I think there were impediments even before. There was a sense that it had perhaps gone too far, and countries were a little resentful of how dependent they were on others. The Chinese even had a theory of dual circulation, which
right,
was an attempt to decouple in some ways to, on the one hand, reduce their dependence on the global economy, increase their domestic economy as a share, but also increase the dependence of the global economy on their economy by inviting more firms in and, in a sense, making them, so to speak, hostages to further conflict. I think what the pandemic did was indicated how you are, in a sense, sensitive to the weakest link. Supply chains grow across the globe. If there's disruption in any part of the supply chain, it disrupts the whole supply chain.
Right.
And because countries were shutting down at different times, the supply chain got disrupted for a long time because it never fully recovered. And of course, we have the transportation snafus with the spring back from the pandemic as demand suddenly went through the roof,
right,
and everybody was ordering, and because they didn't get the order on time, they ordered even more in order to make sure
that created its own backlash.
That created its own backlash. And of course, now with Russia, you find that it's not just sort of things you can't control like the pandemic, but perhaps things within human control, such as the dislike for one regime versus the other, and so on.
Right.
And so that raises a whole new set of questions. Can we only invest or trade with countries we like?
Yes, and also because I wanted to ask you about that, because there's a whole lot of kind of double standards which is being raised, that you now have sanctions against Russia, but the European Union is 40% dependent on Russian energy. And despite the sanctions, they've still kind of ring-fenced that. So they still are importing energy from Russia. And also Russia and Ukraine provide close to anywhere between 40 to 60% of wheat and cooking oil and so on and so forth. So can you really, either for economic reasons or because you don't like a particular regime, can you really de-link, given that you are so dependent?
Well, it's hard. It's hard because we are integrated. Globalization has integrated economies. So, in a sense, somewhat paradoxically, these weapons you use of trade, investment cutoffs, payment cutoffs, they work only because the other countries linked you, because of globalization.
Right.
But because the weapon you use is causing so much pain, the other side is going to think, well, does it make sense for me to be so globalized? Should I back off from globalization? Should I be dependent on the other country either for inputs to my supply chain or as a final consumer of my products? So it is going to cause a lot of angst. I think the weapons are working, but even, as you said, the European Union sees energy as a big part of what Russia supplies, so let's try and stay away from that.
Right.
But in the process of levying sanctions, what happens is there are spillover effects.
You're hurting yourselves as well.
Exactly, because the oil companies say, well, they're applying sanctions on Russia. Do I still want to buy Russian oil? Maybe, 6 months down the line, it becomes really problematic. So let me stop buying at this point. So, companies like Shell, etc., are staying away and have been actually pushed into staying away, even though the sanctions don't cover oil. And so it causes disruption. And of course, the price of natural gas in Europe has shot through the roof.
Right. But also I wanted to ask you that in terms of actual concrete impact, because one argument is that this is not the end of globalization, this is the end of globalization for Russia.
Right.
Because Russia is becoming increasingly isolated, everyone's cut off ties.
Right.
How badly do you think this is already hurting Russia, could hurt Russia down the line, and also how badly is it going to hurt the world economy as a whole?
Right. First on Russia.
Yes.
Look, part of the reason we are applying these sanctions is because the global governance system no longer works. Russia has vetoed everything at the UN, so you don't have a UN sort of sanction on what Russia did.
Correct.
And so, this is a alternative way of punishing a unwarranted assault on a neighboring country, right? So in that sense, it's an attempt to maintain the global order through new weapons, because the old weapons have been, in fact, military weapons have been rendered sort of unusable.
Sure, and
because
diplomacy
of the
and all
paralysis of the UN. But that said, going forward, first, the damage for Russia is going to be substantial economically. I don't think they bargained for sanctions, for example, on their central bank. And they didn't see the large-scale sanctions on everything, including the spillovers from, even sanctions on energy.
Right.
They thought that would be sort of
left alone,
but it is starting to hurt them. So, estimates, nobody really knows because we haven't been in this situation before, but
Sure.
estimates I've seen from the investment banks which do this for a living is a 10% fall in growth. In other words, they were expected to grow at 2 or 3 percentage points. Now they're going to be minus 10.
It's a massive drop.
It's like the global financial crisis for Russia.
Yeah.
Okay. It's like the pandemic was for India. So I think that's a big effect. It probably is bigger because with all these sort of secondary effects, of course, a lot depends on how long this continues. But if Russia sort of doesn't withdraw soon, the sanctions aren't lifted soon, the impact over the course of the year could be quite substantial. Second, Russia and Ukraine are both big commodity producers.
Yes.
So the prices of commodities have gone through the roof. We've seen it in wheat, we've seen it in oil, we've seen it in natural gas,
Yes.
but also in commodities that are less used. Neon, we've got copper. We've got a whole bunch of commodities which these guys produce, which are starting to impact global supply chains even more. And remember, it comes on top of already high inflation.
I was about to say.
Absolutely. So it makes that inflation more entrenched, which means the reaction to inflation, which is what we're seeing with the Federal Reserve, has to be stronger than it was. So in other words, war reduces growth, increases inflation.
Right, and
Neither
it has a
of which is
knock-on
nice.
effect for the whole world.
Exactly. It's an effect through the world. So I think no country is immune. Of course, some countries benefit. Some of the commodity producers are going to benefit from higher oil prices, for example.
Right.
But they're going to be affected adversely in other ways.
Looking at India, because India is also heavily dependent on Russia for its arms imports. About 66% of all of India's arms are imported from Russia. It's supposed to be somewhere around $36 billion worth. Russian oil, we're still not that dependent. As you know, it's mostly from the Middle East. But arms is one of the big reasons why India, again, has been walking this precarious tightrope on Russia. Again, coming to that point of this over-dependence on A or B country for a country like India, what's the path moving forward? Because as Russia gets more and more sanctioned, how is that going to work? How are you going to get your weapons? How will you do business?
Yeah, so we have to think in two ways, right? As a business, we would think of one, diversifying our supply chain, buy from a greater variety of producers, but also produce more internally.
Right.
So both aspects have to be what we focus on going forward. That is, and certainly for key aspects of our defense, there's no real alternative to being self-sufficient.
Right.
that will take time, of course. We've talked about this again and again.
That's right. Make in India, all of that has been going on for years.
And even the indigenous produced, for example, fighters, have substantial components that are bought in whole from outside, the engine, the avionics, and so on. So we have to make sure that over time we indigenize much more of that. But that's what stares us in the face.
That's the only way. In fact, I heard an interesting term about all of this, about this debate on globalization, that is now being called friend-shoring. So instead of offshoring, where you source your material or your equipment or your hardware or energy from offshore, it's friend-shored. In other words, friend or friendly countries help you supplement some of that balance. So for example, America is finding ways of getting Europe to be less dependent on Russian energy from finding energy from other sources. Similarly, you had a top American diplomat in New Delhi a few days ago saying that we'll try and source you Russian-style armaments from other sources.
Right.
So this is another kind of
absolutely
variant of globalization.
I think it is a variant, but we have to, we have to recognize that in this kind of environment, friend today may not be a friend tomorrow.
Yes.
And friends are about more things than just, temporary strategic alignments. They're about consistency in values.
Right.
So one of the worries is that the world now starts splitting up based on a broader set of values.
Right.
The democratic countries into one block, the authoritarian countries into another block, and within the authoritarian countries, some can't stand each other, so they separate into further blocks. So this is a balkanization of the world, and it's based on not just who am I friendly or okay with today, but what can happen tomorrow, based on internal developments or external developments. So we have to be a little wary in this kind of environment, and either have really good friends, or another alternative which we didn't talk about is the possibility of getting others to site their factories domestically. So FDI, nobody can control what you have internally.
Right.
So
you mean to have the production centers in your shores?
That's what you can control. That's the only thing you can control. And if the production centers are in your shore but owned by foreign entities, then that still gives you some control in bad times.
Sure. That's again a huge challenge. We've been trying to do that again for years, but it's slow. And I wanted to come back to that, because even saying to India that, look, we'll get you weapons from somewhere and all of that, isn't that easy? Because as you know, after we got into our recent border troubles with China over the Galwan incidents, we started to decouple a bit, and we started to pull back, and we tried to reduce our trade deficit with China. But the share of China's India's total merchandise imports is steadily going up. It's currently 16%, about $65 billion worth of imports. So it's not that easy to de-link.
It is not. And this is the worry about the end of globalization. Trying to produce everything domestically is going to be hugely costly. So my sense is what is going to happen over time is countries are going to try and have some kind of lever over the countries they do partners with. So one example is, you said, friend-shoring, just doing business with your friends.
Yes.
Another is doing business with not quite enemies, but frenemies, and making sure that you have some lever over them.
Right.
If they act antsy towards you, you can push back in some ways.
The other question I wanted to ask you is about, again, countries finding ways around this, right? And there's this whole question mark over the primacy of the dollar now, with Russia looking to trade only in rubles, China is looking to buy oil from Saudi Arabia in yuan. Is there any serious threat or challenge to the primacy of the dollar?
I think not yet. I do think, however, that, and this is something that US officials have also expressed to me, a worry that the increasing militarization of dollar payments, of dollar reserve assets, and that was one step that wasn't seen before that was taken this time, basically telling the Russians they couldn't use their dollar reserves or their euro reserves.
When you say militarization, you mean in terms of actually like the kind of political...
Using it as a weapon.
As
weaponization, weaponization of these assets.
Right.
They've worried that what this will do is make the others look for alternatives, which is a very, very understandable reaction. So the Chinese, in reaction to the weaponization of payments, which happened with Iran, which happened with other countries, built up their own parallel payment system, which hasn't been fully operational yet. It works through SWIFT so far, but it is something that the Chinese, at short order, could sort of, in a sense, bring into operation.
Right.
And of course, the Chinese will then say, well, who else wants to join?
This
Guys will not...
club.
Right. Exactly. And it is quite possible that a number of countries may join. And in fact, a number of countries may join both the SWIFT and the Chinese payment, just so that no...
You're leveraging risk.
Exactly. So competition may be a good thing, but if the two systems don't talk to each other, then you have a real problem. So my sense is there's an increasing worry that as you weaponize trade, as you weaponize investment, as you weaponize
dollar
payments, that you are seeing yet another impediment to globalization, that countries will say, wait a minute, do I want to be subject to all this? So I think that post this conflict, it's in the interests of the industrial countries to say, let's pause a second and ask, can we roll out these weapons so easily? Should we have checks and balances? Now remember, the reason they've rolled it out, which is fully understandable, is because the UN is impotent.
Right.
But making this sort of roll out easily is also a concern, because the other, all the others, more independent countries, are going to say, well, what if I do something wrong? Will I be subject to sanctions?
Right.
So, in that sense, I think there is a
risk. At the moment, you're saying there's no real challenge to the primacy of the dollar.
Right.
But if this is used as an instrumentality too often, then that could become a bigger problem. Let me ask you one other strand which seems to be connecting some of what we're seeing, and this actually traverses from Putin's Russia to the Rajapaksa Sri Lanka, which is the dangers of strongman politics. We've clearly seen what's happened in Russia, and there's not enough attention to what's happened in Sri Lanka, which, as you know, is going through this enormous economic crisis, part of which is believed to be sort of unilateral decisions taken by the current regime, whether it was abruptly slashing taxes, whether it was leading to a kind of coercive switch to organic farming, which led to a kind of a food crisis. So there's that aspect to it as well. How much of that, we talk of strongman politics more as a kind of political challenge or a kind of challenge to, societies within. But this is turning out to be something bigger.
Yes, it's a challenge both domestically and internationally. Part of the benefit of being democratic is checks and balances on the government. So one person's will doesn't become the rule. And if that person is, even the most benevolent of people, they can make mistakes. But they typically aren't the most benevolent of people. They're narcissistic, they're very self-important, very focused on their power. And to them, it matters far less if the whole country is subject to hardship. So long as it reflects their strength and glory, their decisiveness, their ability to take hard decisions. And of course, it can, to the extent it spills over, create hardship for the country, as we've seen with Putin. The question is, how much advice do these authoritarian leaders get? How much contrarian views do they absorb, especially when you've killed an independent press? How much do you listen? How much do your sort of officials have the courage to tell you you're doing something wrong here? And the problem is, often they build a cocoon around themselves,
and
they don't hear anything different from their opinion. And then they make really big mistakes. Domestically, as you saw with Sri Lanka, internationally, as you saw with Putin, it seems to be more or less a serious misjudgment.
And how much of that is a threat or a worry for a country like India, which is again tilting in that direction?
Well, it is a worry, right? We've had a few decisions which don't seem to have had a lot of reflection behind them. Demonetization, we've had the 4-hour sort of time frame in order to shut down in the pandemic. Of course, these can be, you can keep debating what was the rationale, etc., etc. But it doesn't seem like a lot of debate has gone in. Demonetization, perhaps you couldn't have had that debate. But certainly for the lockdown,
you could have war-gamed its consequences
better. You could have war-gamed within a small circle, and you should have had contrarian views, etc. You should have, but
the pandemic, again, the lockdown at just a 4-hour notice.
Exactly. So the worry, of course, in all this is as the people at the top see their success reinforced, it creates a sense of hubris. We know, and therefore, why should we listen to the others? And of course, if you suppress dissent, suppress criticism, where are the alternative voices? And even within the government, if people sort of feel that my job is at stake if I express a different opinion, even if the people at the top say, tell me, I want to hear, you're not going to hear anything. You're just going to hear applause. Fantastic, great performance, until it turns.
Do you see any shift in that in the Indian context, or do you still see the same patterns, the same manner in which
well, it's hard to say.
Things are functioning?
It's hard to say because I'm certainly not in government circles today, but I do think this, the string of election victories recently reinforces the sense that we're on the right track. The people have just given us a resounding sort of endorsement. And my worry is what the people are endorsing and what is taken as what has been endorsed may be different.
Sure.
And the people may be celebrating the fact that they get their rations easily, or that they have a easy toilet or something like that, which they didn't have access to before.
Sure.
While the message you're taking is this implies our majoritarian policies are worth pursuing.
Sure.
And that, I think, is tremendously dangerous for the country.
Well, when you look at overall what's happening with our economy, which is faced these multiple shocks going back to demonetization, and then there was, of course, GST, and then you had several cycles of the pandemic. And we've had these conversations before about whether the government's response has been adequate enough to make up for the damage, especially to millions of those who are living at the lower tiers of the economy. What are the threads or strands that you're seeing? Are you seeing some indications that there is a kind of recovery, or is it more at the sort of higher tiers of the economy?
There certainly is a rebound, right? Anytime you go down really badly, you come up. And we're seeing a rebound, for sure. We're also seeing, at the top tiers, a strengthening of certain companies, a strengthening of big companies. Some of them have been clever enough to use the period to raise equity, to reduce some of their debt. Banks, I don't know what the true bad loan position is because there's been some forbearance. But certainly banks seem to have brought down some of the bad loans and raised some of the equity positions. So that's the good news. That makes the economy look a lot healthier. The bad news is that there's a lower tier which has suffered, where you see the high levels of unemployment, and some of this is structural. It's been growing.
Yes.
Huge levels of unemployment. And as a result, they are much less sort of willing to spend at this point. And so you saw the manufacturing recovery,
yes,
but then a plateauing, because the pent-up demand for manufacturing had plateaued out.
Sure.
Right now you're seeing a services recovery.
Right.
But services may also plateau if this lower segment of the population simply doesn't have the wherewithal.
Right.
For that, you need genuine growth beyond rebound growth,
right,
which means many more jobs, much more of a sense of confidence in the future. I think one thing which is looking up is, of course, exports, on which we have good numbers, but we must correct those numbers for the price rise.
Right.
Because a 7% rise in dollar prices
is also padding up
some of that. But I think there is a genuine global recovery in exports. That you see that even in our imports. Our imports have gone up, which is why our current account deficit has gone up.
Right.
But I think so. We have a two-tier recovery. My worry is that we should be paying much more attention to the lower tier, not just in terms of food grains, but in terms of education.
Yes.
Because the lost education for our children is going to weigh on this generation for many years to come. And today we have kids who are effectively getting a double promotion. They haven't spent the 2 years learning, but they're going up 2 classes. If you subject them to the same learning standards as before, you'll have an enormous dropout rate, because these kids will be lost in class.
No, you're right. There's that challenge, and of course, as you mentioned, like, you really must have genuine growth, not just the pent-up, the backlog. But while you're trying to achieve that, comes war. So you think, I've just about recovered from a couple of cycles of the pandemic.
Right.
comes war with all the attendant economic challenges. Very loud, completely out of time. Is that already going to carry a risk of the contracting of growth for India and the world?
Well, the war takes, I mean, just think about it. We net import 1.5 billion barrels of oil.
Right.
So $30 increase in the price of oil means a $45 billion net subtraction from our GDP. There are offsets, etc. So on net, when I've looked at the estimates, it's about a 1% drop off in growth. Okay, but remember also
for India.
For India, but you have to look at the overall picture because it feeds through.
Yes.
In the Economic Times today, you hear about a bunch of gas-using entities closing down because gas prices have gone through the roof. So the spillover effects of higher commodity prices can be quite substantial in the economy.
Right.
That's an additional headwind we didn't need at this point. And so my sense is this is a time of very great risk. We need absolutely picture-perfect economic management to get through this. We have some, areas of tremendous success. The IT industry is doing really well, very hard to find IT personnel. We have a ton of unicorns. But let's celebrate that, but let's not get confused that that's all there is. There's also a risky downside, which we need to worry about.
Okay. Well, wise words as always, Dr. Rajan, but great to have you. And thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
Thank you.